Harlem in the late 1960s was a place where loyalty was currency and betrayal was usually loud, bloody, and final. Frank Lucas had risen through that world with a reputation that confused outsiders. He was ruthless when necessary, but disciplined to a fault. He believed chaos attracted attention, and attention shortened lives. People around him learned that silence often meant safety. Before we go any deeper into this story, let me say something quietly, the way Frank himself might have preferred it. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. If you appreciate stories rooted in real history and told with honesty, subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream. Now understand this. Everything that followed began with a friend who believed $50,000 was worth more than a lifetime of loyalty. The man who took the money was not a stranger. He wasn't a rival or an outsider looking for opportunity. He was someone who had eaten at Frank's table, laughed in his home, and benefited from the very system Frank had built. $50,000 in those days was a fortune. Enough to disappear, start over, and never look back. The offer came quietly, passed through intermediaries who believed greed always found a way in. The plan was simple, almost elegant in its cowardice. Poison slipped into a drink during a private meeting. No witnesses, no noise, no trail leading back to men who wanted Frank gone. Frank Lucas sensed something was off long before the glass reached his lips. Years in the streets sharpened instincts that no amount of money could buy. He noticed the tension in the room, the way his friend avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in his hand. Frank didn't react immediately. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He did what had kept him alive longer than most. He observed. In that moment, Frank already knew the truth. The question was no longer whether betrayal had occurred, but how it would be answered. Later that night, Frank sat alone, turning the glass slowly in his hand, watching the liquid catch the light. He wasn't angry. Anger was for men who acted without thinking. What he felt instead was clarity. Violence would be easy. Revenge would be expected. But Frank Lucas understood something deeper about power. Fear fades, but messages last. The poison wasn't just an attempt on his life. It was an opportunity. And by the time he stood up, the decision had already been made. Whatever he was about to do next would be talked about for years, not because it was brutal, but because no one had ever handled betrayal quite this way before. The next morning unfolded like any other in Harlem, and that was what made it unsettling. Frank Lucas moved through his routine without disruption, greeting familiar faces, listening more than he spoke, allowing the neighborhood to breathe around him. Those closest to him noticed nothing unusual, yet something invisible had shifted. Frank had not slept much. Not because of fear, but because his mind was working through layers of consequence. He replayed every detail the night before, the room, the glass, the man's hand shaking just enough to betray guilt. In Frank's world, betrayal wasn't shocking. What mattered was how it was addressed, because the response became the precedent. The friend avoided Frank for most of the day, claiming errands, obligations, minor excuses that sounded thin even to himself. Every delay only confirmed what Frank already knew. By afternoon, Frank asked for him directly, calmly, without urgency. The request carried no threat, and that was precisely why it could not be refused. When the man finally arrived, he expected anger, maybe violence. Instead, he was met with Frank's steady gaze and an invitation to sit. The glass from the night before was placed gently between them, untouched, as if time itself had paused around it. Frank didn't accuse him. He spoke about loyalty, about how Harlem was built on trust long before it was built on money. He reminded him of favors given, of doors opened, of protection extended when none was required. Each word landed heavier than a punch. The friend began to sweat, his breath uneven, his rehearsed lies dissolving under the weight of Frank's composure. When Frank finally mentioned the poison, his voice did not change. There was no rage in it, only disappointment, which somehow felt worse. Then Frank did something no one in the room expected. He pushed the glass slightly closer to the man and told him the truth. The poison had already been tested. Frank had known enough to never let uncertainty decide his fate. The liquid was deadly, potent, and unforgiving. He explained this the way a doctor might explain a diagnosis, clearly, without emotion. The friend froze, realization spreading across his face. Whatever he had imagined would happen next, it wasn't this. And that was exactly the point. Frank leaned back, giving him space, and finally made it clear violence was unnecessary. Death was optional. But the message had to be permanent. The poison had been meant to erase Frank Lucas quietly. Instead, Frank was about to decide where it would end up, and that decision, whatever it was, would echo far beyond that room. The truth came out slowly, dragged into the open by the sheer pressure of silence. The friend began to talk, not because Frank demanded it, but because the room allowed no escape. $50,000. That was a number. Cash delivered in parts, promised by men who had no intention of ever being seen. They didn't want Frank's territory. They didn't want his name. They wanted his absence. Frank listened without interruption, committing every detail to memory. The names hinted at but never fully spoken, the locations, the timing. This was not new to him. Harlem in that era was filled with men who believed removing Frank Lucas would create space for themselves. They were wrong, but ignorance had always been expensive. Frank asked a single question that cut deeper than all the others: whether the money had been worth it. The man couldn't answer. His eyes dropped to the floor, his hands clenched so tightly they shook. $50,000 had seemed abstract when the offer was made, just numbers and possibility. Now it had weight. Frank explained calmly that loyalty had a value too, one that couldn't be counted or replaced. He spoke about the years it took to build trust in a world designed to break it, and how one careless decision could unravel everything a man thought he was protecting. Outside the room, Harlem continued as if nothing unusual was happening. That contrast mattered to Frank. He wanted the lesson to exist within normal life, not explode beyond it. He understood that spectacle attracted law enforcement, and law enforcement ended empires. What he planned had to be controlled, contained, and unforgettable. The poison sat between them like a third presence, silent but heavy. It had already failed in its original purpose. Now it awaited a new one. Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. He told the man something that would stay with him forever: that death was easy and forgiveness was meaningless without consequence. What mattered was accountability. He turned back slowly, picked up the glass, and made it clear that the poison would not disappear. It would be used, not in anger, not in chaos, but as a message carefully delivered. And when it was over, no one in Harlem would ever again confuse access to Frank Lucas with permission to betray him. Frank Lucas did not act immediately, and that delay terrified the man more than any threat ever could. Days passed, then weeks. The friend remained alive, untouched, allowed to walk Harlem freely under an unspoken shadow. People noticed. Whispers began. In a world where betrayal usually ended in blood, the absence of violence felt unnatural. Frank understood that fear grows best in uncertainty. He wanted the city watching, wondering, trying to guess what kind of punishment waited for a man who had tried to poison the most powerful figure in Harlem. During that time, Frank quietly gathered information, not through force, but through memory. He traced the path of the money, confirmed suspicions about rivals who had hoped to remove him without exposing themselves. These were men who believed Frank was too disciplined, too political, too careful to respond in a way that would scare them. They mistook restraint for limitation. Frank intended to correct that misunderstanding, not with bullets, but with a lesson that would travel faster than violence ever could. When the meeting finally happened, it was not in a dark basement or a back alley. It was in a neutral space, a private room where deals were normally made and disputes quietly resolved. Several respected figures were present, men whose opinions shaped Harlem's underworld. Frank wanted witnesses, not to the act itself, but to the logic behind it. He spoke calmly, explaining what had happened, never naming the would-be buyers, never dramatizing betrayal. He placed the glass on the table and let silence do the work. Then Frank did the unthinkable. He did not force the poison on the man. Instead, he poured the liquid slowly into a separate container, sealed it, and handed it back to him. He told him the truth. The poison was now his responsibility, not to drink, but to live with. The money was gone. His protection was gone. His name would never again be trusted. He would wake up every day knowing how close he had come to ending his own life for $50,000 and how completely he had destroyed it instead. The room understood immediately. This was worse than death. The man left alive, but erased. No crew would take him in. No deals would include him. He would move through Harlem unseen, untouchable not by power, but by irrelevance. Frank Lucas never raised his voice. He never spilled blood. But in that moment, everyone present understood something new about him. Betrayal under his rule did not end lives. It ended existence. The effect was immediate and brutal, in its own quiet way. By the following week, the man discovered what it meant to be alive without a place in Harlem. Familiar corners went cold when he approached. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men who once nodded at him now looked past him as if he were part of the scenery. He wasn't threatened. He wasn't chased. He was ignored, and in that world, being ignored was the closest thing to death. Frank Lucas had not needed to say a word. The message had traveled faster than any rumor, because it carried a logic everyone understood. Frank, meanwhile, returned his routines with the same discipline that had carried him this far. He attended meetings, oversaw shipments, and spoke about expansion with the calm certainty of a man who had removed uncertainty from his environment. Those who dealt with him noticed a subtle shift in tone around his name. He was no longer discussed as merely powerful or wealthy. He was described as final. The kind of man whose decisions did not invite negotiation after fact. Violence still existed in Harlem, but it orbited Frank rather than touched him. The men who had paid the $50,000 felt the consequences next, not through confrontation, but through denial. Doors closed. Opportunities vanished. Their names stopped circulating in serious conversations. They had assumed Frank's restraint would make him predictable. Instead, it had made him unchallengeable. No one wanted to be associated with a move that had failed so completely and so publicly. The poison had not killed Frank Lucas. It had exposed the poor judgment of everyone involved. Late one night, Frank reflected on the choice he had made. There had been other options, simpler ones. But simplicity, he believed, rarely built lasting order. What he wanted was stability, a Harlem where ambition existed within boundaries, and loyalty was understood as survival, not sentiment. The man who had betrayed him would wake every morning knowing he was breathing borrowed air in a city that no longer recognized him. And Frank knew that lesson would outlive them both. Harlem adjusted quickly, as it always did, but it never forgot. The story of the poison was never told in full, never repeated with names or details, yet everyone seemed to know exactly what had happened. Men spoke about it indirectly, lowering their voices when the subject drifted too close. The lesson embedded itself into the culture. Frank Lucas was not a man you tested impulsively. He did not react the way others did. He did not explode. He recalculated. And once he recalculated, the outcome was permanent. What unsettled people most was not what Frank had done, but what he had refused to do. He had not killed a friend. He had not demanded blood. He had denied something far more valuable, belonging, in a world where survival depended on networks. Frank had demonstrated that he controlled not just territory, but legitimacy. To be cut off by him was to be cut off from Harlem itself. That realization traveled faster than fear ever could, because it appealed to self-preservation rather than panic. Law enforcement noticed a shift as well. Violence around Frank's operations decreased. Disputes were settled more quietly. Associates policed themselves with unusual discipline. To outsiders, it looked like maturity. To insiders, it was clarity. Everyone understood the boundaries now, and boundaries reduced chaos. Frank Lucas, without issuing a single public threat, had stabilized his empire more effectively than any campaign of violence ever could. Years later, men who had once considered challenging Frank would admit the truth in private. After the poison incident, the idea of betrayal felt pointless. There was nothing to gain. Death would have been easier to accept. What Frank offered instead was a consequence that followed you every day you remained alive, and that, more than guns or money, was why no one ever tried again. Time did what violence never could. It made the lesson permanent. As months passed, the incident with the poison stopped being discussed directly, Yet it shaped every interaction around Frank Lucas. New associates were not told the story. They absorbed it through behavior. They noticed how veterans spoke to Frank without posturing, how meetings ran smoother, how disagreements dissolved before becoming confrontations. The absence of fear was what unsettled newcomers most. Respect, they learned, was not demanded under Frank's rule, it was assumed. And assumptions, once embedded, were stronger than threats. The man who had taken the $50,000 became something else entirely. Not a traitor to be hunted, not a cautionary tale shouted in bars, but a living symbol of consequence. People recognized him, but never acknowledged him. He could stand in a room and still be alone. Offers never came. Questions were never answered. His presence carried a quiet discomfort, as if everyone feared that engaging with him might contaminate their own standing. Frank had turned one man into a boundary that no one dared to cross. Frank himself never checked on the man's fate. He didn't need to. Control, in his view, was not about monitoring outcomes. It was about designing them. Harlem had accepted the rule without resistance. Disputes declined. Loyalty solidified. Those inside Frank's circle understood that survival under him did not depend on brutality, but on discipline. The poison had failed to kill him, but it had succeeded in revealing who around him lacked both. Years later, when men tried to explain why Frank Lucas had become so difficult to challenge, they rarely mentioned guns or money. They spoke instead about certainty, about how crossing him didn't lead to chaos, but to erasure. The poison incident had stripped betrayal of its reward. It taught everyone watching that under Frank's control, consequences were not emotional reactions. They were structures. And once built, structures do not forget. By the time the story reached its final form, it no longer belonged to Frank Lucas alone. It belonged to Harlem. The poison that had once been meant to erase him had transformed into something far more enduring, a rule everyone understood without ever seeing it written. Men adjusted their behavior instinctively. Deals were honored more carefully. Words were chosen with intention. Loyalty stopped being a performance and became a requirement for survival. Frank didn't enforce this with speeches or warnings. He allowed the environment to enforce it for him, which was always more effective. Frank himself never framed what happened as mercy or cruelty. In private moments, he understood it as alignment. Betrayal had been corrected in a way that didn't invite retaliation, escalation, or legend hunters. There was no body to avenge, no blood to answer for. Law enforcement found nothing to investigate. Rivals found nothing to exploit. What remained was a perfectly sealed outcome. Clean, irreversible, and invisible to anyone who wasn't meant to see it. That invisibility was the true genius of the response. As years passed and Frank's name grew heavier with influence, those close to him realized the poison incident marked the moment his power matured. Before it, he was feared. After it, he was anticipated. People didn't wait to see how he would react. They adjusted themselves beforehand. That shift changed everything. It meant Frank no longer needed to demonstrate control. He embodied it. The man who had accepted $50,000 to betray him had unintentionally helped Frank reach that point, at the cost of his own existence. And that is why the story endured long after the details faded. Not because someone tried to poison Frank Lucas, but because of what followed. The poison never touched Frank's lips. Instead, it reshaped the rules of loyalty around him. No shouting, no violence, just a decision so final that it removed betrayal as an option entirely. In a world addicted to noise, Frank Lucas proved that the quietest responses leave the deepest marks, and once those marks are made, they never disappear.